All right, we are live on YouTube. Let me now. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the Montgomery County Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We just opened our doors. Takes a couple minutes on YouTube. Welcome, everybody. And on Zoom. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're in that waiting period of letting everybody in the door on Zoom, but this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Welcome to everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Give it one more minute. We'll get started. We hit one more, my magic number, and then we'll start. Or a minute, whichever happens first. And there it is. Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. A couple things as we get started. If you have any questions or concerns for us or one of our panelists this evening, please put it in the chat. That's what we monitor. Questions, concerns, comments, please put them in the chat. As everyone should know at this time, the County Council is considering rent stabilization proposals from two different directions. One is called the anti-rent gouging bill, and that bill includes provisions to allow rents to rise a little over 12% and excludes small landlords. But it also has provisions in it to support renter outreach and education and the building of affordable housing. And it also exempts new investment in the building of housing if that law were to become law. The other law is called the Home Act, the other proposal. The Home Act would limit rent increases at 3% and would include all landlords, small and large, would also exempt any new investment in new properties. But as for my knowledge, does not include a whole lot other than that. But certainly sets a much stronger limit on rent increases. So there's very different two proposals that are out there. And we intend as the Renters Alliance to continue a dialogue with those on both sides in either camp on what rent stabilization is, what its impacts are, addressing many of the objections to rent stabilization. We are confident that many of those objections are unfounded, but we also believe that our ears are open. If somebody's got some good information, we'd like to hear it. But we also think that there's a lot of rumor and misunderstanding and so on that's out there. And frankly, there are some bad actors who are putting some information out there intended to torpedo any movement towards stabilizing rents in Montgomery County. The Renters Alliance has seen rent increases in the double digits and evictions are skyrocketing. We are seeing the forced migration of working and low-income families and seniors and middle-class folks who have done the math and figured that if the rents are going to rise like this over the next few years, they're not going to be able to stay here any longer. So we as a community have to decide what the role of stable, affordable housing is in Montgomery County. So a couple things. Tonight we have my own staff, Pat Beckham and Malek Demir, who will be monitoring the chat and keeping track of your all's comments and concerns. And we have Natalia Carrizosa, if I pronounced that correctly, from the Office of Legislative Oversight, which is doing a study on behalf of the County Council on the issues and impacts of rent stabilization. And we'll get to Natalia in just a moment. But we also have with us one of our esteemed board members, Brandy Brooks, who has been a renter herself, a renter advocate, and testified at the very important first hearing on these bills on March 28th, where more than 80 people testified in favor and in opposition to these bills. So I will say predominantly in favor of these bills. And let me just, as did I and other members of our board and scores of renters. Let me just say something. There were people on either wing of testimony. Obviously, there were some very passionate ideological renters who want a lot of things that they're probably not going to get. And on the other side, there was landlords who were very hyperbolic about how the sky is going to fall and the Russians are going to invade and all kinds of terrible things are going to happen if we pass rent stabilization. And then the majority in the middle saying, hey, look, this is sensible, good public policy. There are elements in both bills that are valuable, though the majority were in favor of a much more reasonable rent increase as opposed to a double-digit rent increase that the anti-rent gouging bill is putting forward. But there is, in the middle, a majority discussion on what seems like a good public policy direction, and we intend to keep that dialogue going. So it's my pleasure to introduce our fellow board member, Brandy Brooks, who had her own remarks and own thoughts on the issue. Brandy?
Thanks so much, Matt. And again, thanks to all of you for attending. Part of what we do at the Renters Alliance and what we've done since our formation is get engaged in legislation that impacts renters in Montgomery County at the county level and at the state level. So in addition to the testimony that we may do as board members or that Matt or other staff may do, the engagement of the renter community in testifying, in speaking with people about the impacts of this kind of legislation is really, really critical and is something that we've been committed to supporting ever since our founding. And you're gonna hear about a couple of different ways that you will have an opportunity to make sure that your voice is heard as part of this conversation. But I did, as Matt mentioned, want to share a little bit about my experience of participating in the hearing that took place last week. As Matt mentioned, there were actually, I think it was about 100 people overall across the two hearings who testified on the bills. Overwhelmingly, the testimony was in favor of rent stabilization as a critical goal for our county. And of the people who supported rent stabilization in some form or another, overwhelmingly, they were supporting the HOME Act as the piece of legislation that does a much better job of really reaching the goals of protecting renters. And I was one of those folks because I'm a renter, and actually every member of my family who lives in Montgomery County is also a renter. And so I took the opportunity to share in my testimony about our experience as a renter, and in particular, to share the experience of my mother. I want to give a shout out to her. She's on the call, Carol McSween Brooks, and she allowed me to share as part of my public testimony her story of being a senior renter in Montgomery County on a fixed income, like so many renters who are seniors with disabilities, with other particular needs in our county. And she allowed me to talk about the fact that her rent in what's considered an affordable rental unit in an affordable part of the county, Aspen Hill, actually amounts to over 60% of her monthly income. And to talk about the impact that that has for her and for us as a family when it comes to making sure that all of my mom's other basic needs, we're not talking about luxuries, we're talking about basic needs, like the need to have health care, the need to have medication, the need to put food on the table, the struggle that that creates when you are looking at 60% or more in of your income being your rental cost. And again, that's not counting utilities, that's not counting anything else. And it's devastating. And one of the things that I heard during this hearing is how many people are in that kind of situation. And we're not just talking about our seniors, although they are definitely one of those groups that is particularly impacted by this. We are talking families of all sizes and types, people who have lived here in the county for all different lengths of time, but people who are seeing increases of hundreds of dollars when they renew their rent, which translates into those double-digit increases that Matt was talking about, and person after person, including a couple of young high school students, Montgomery County, like middle school and high school students who were testifying about the impact that this has had on them as renters, the impact that they see it have on their colleagues, their fellow students. And so it's really serious and very important that we get this right for so many families, for hundreds of thousands of people in Montgomery County of all income scales, across all different spectrums, all different family types. And I think one of the things that's important is, as Matt mentioned, there was sometimes a lot of hyperbole flying around, especially for folks who really were saying that rent stabilization would end housing production or end good housing management in Montgomery County. And what I really wanted to make sure in both my verbal and my written testimony is that we focus on the facts of what this means, that we focus on the actual numbers in terms of what this impact looks like for people. And I want to just take a quick moment. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm able to share screen, but I did want to note that part of my written testimony was actually to be able to just break down the numbers. What do these rent increases look like for someone if they are in a situation similar to my mom, or even if they are a different kind of family? And what do the impacts look like when someone is looking at rent increases versus looking at under the Home Act, which is Bill 1623, versus under the anti-rent gouging bill, as it is called, which is Bill 1523. And so just to do really quickly, and it was a lot of numbers, a lot of text, but I wanted to show one of the great things about the Home Act is that when you crunch these numbers, it actually at minimum tends to keep people's rents pretty steady. And depending on how rent increases go, the cost of living adjustments go for someone on a fixed income, can actually help to slowly decrease their rent burden over time. So we can see that this legislation at least keeps things from getting more out of whack and can possibly be very, very helpful. Whereas if you look at what happens under the impact of what's called the anti-rent gouging bill, you see that the rental cost burden for someone steadily goes up. You see someone getting annual rent increases of $100, $150, $200 as time goes on, and how unaffordable that can increasingly become for someone. And the same holds true even if you're not necessarily on a fixed income, but if you're a working family with kids. Again, there are benefits in which the Home Act actually helps to keep things stable and helps to keep things in the range of affordability when you just crunch some basic numbers. Whereas what happens, again, under the anti-rent gouging bill is you start to see things switch over. And even if you start in an affordable place, you move more and more into the case of your rent costs starting to exceed that 30% mark, which is typically considered affordable when we talk about affordable housing. And so one of the things as I close that I just really wanted to make sure that we do in our testimony is, yes, there are deeply emotional and personal stories behind this, but there is also the practical reality of what this means in terms of people's housing security. And at the end of the day, when we look at rent stabilization as one of a host of measures that need to be implemented in order to ensure affordable housing in Montgomery County, it is an essential tool as far as keeping rents affordable and allowing people to continue to stay in our county while we also continue to work on issues around supply, while we also continue to work on issues of how much affordable housing that we are building. Rent stabilization is not going to solve all of that any more than any other piece of legislation is going to solve all of affordable housing, but rent stabilization is excellent at the piece of this that it works to fix, and it doesn't prevent you from being able to address the other components of building true affordable housing in Montgomery County.
Thanks, Brandy. I also like to throw in, whenever I have a public policy discussion against a lot of resistance, we always have to ask the question of what happens if we don't do it. The people always complain about the costs or the we won't make as much profit as we thought we were going to make. But what's the cost if we don't do it? What about our kids not doing as well in school because they have to move from house to house or school to school? What about the healthcare costs of seniors increasingly suffering the anxiety and the devastation of having to move and not knowing where to go? Increased crime rates and so on. These are actual financial costs that we will all pay. So the math is something that needs to be considered as we get into the serious negotiations with both parties for both bills and the county executive's office. The Renters Alliance has taken a formal position not to be focused on the numbers, though we tend to favor a bill that is more favorable to renters if those are our only choices. But in our statement to the county, we believe that a landlord has a right to maintain their profits and keep up with legitimate expenses, balanced with tenants' need to know what their rents are going to be, to not have excessive rent increases, and to have stable, affordable housing. So that's our position, and we look forward to a serious, sober, good faith discussion on how to get to a reasonable piece of legislation. I think we are very clear, however, that double-digit rent increases are not reasonable. So we certainly have that position right now. So let me not forget to say one thing. Happy Passover to everyone who is with us tonight, who celebrates Passover, and to all those who are not with us because they are at a Seder tonight. This is a recorded town hall, and so they can watch at another time. We are equal opportunity offenders. We are also having our next rented town hall during Ramadan, but we feel that the conversation of rent stabilization and other renter issues needs to continue. Again, happy Passover to everybody for tonight. Happy Good Friday, happy Easter over the weekend, and all the holidays that I'm missing. Happy. Now with that, let me introduce our panelist guest tonight, who's with the Office of Legislative Oversight, Natalia Carrizosa. Natalia, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I work for the County Council's Office of Legislative Oversight, and as Matt mentioned, I am currently working with two of my colleagues on a study on what we're calling rent regulations, because the terminology, people have a lot of different words for laws that regulate how much landlords can increase the rent. We're just calling it rent regulations in our study. I'm going to quickly go over who I am and what the Office of Legislative Oversight does and the scope of the study. And I'm also going to be sharing today my contact information, because I do encourage anyone who's listening today, watching today, to reach out to me if you want to share your experiences as a renter. We're definitely interested in hearing that, and I'll explain a little bit more as I talk about the project. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about our study on rent regulations that the council asked our office to conduct. Let's see. So, but before I get into the details of the study, a little bit about the Office of Legislative Oversight. We are an independent office of the County Council. We're responsible for helping the council to fulfill its oversight function by providing accurate information, analysis, and independent findings and recommendations. We don't work for any particular council member. We work for the council as an institution. And our office is, it kind of has two big areas of responsibility. One is to produce impact statements for legislation, and that is separate from the project that I'm talking about today. But I did want to mention them because just this past week, my colleagues did release the economic, racial equity and social justice and climate impact statements for the two bills that are being considered. And I'll share the link to that in case anybody is interested in reading those. And I'm also more than happy to direct you to my colleagues if anyone has any questions about those statements. But as I mentioned, that's a little bit separate from what I am talking about today, which is the study on rent regulations, which is one of our more in-depth research projects. So every year, the council approves a work program for our office that has a list of different projects on a variety of different topics. Sometimes it's a evaluation of a particular government program. Sometimes it's more like this particular study that I'm working on, which is more of a research piece. So what is this particular study going to look at? First, it's going to have case studies on rent regulations implemented in other jurisdictions and looking at all kind of the details of those policies. We're also going to be looking at the history of rent regulations in Montgomery County as part of that sort of case study piece. We also are going to include a literature review looking at the social and economic impacts of rent regulations, including impacts on racial equity and social justice. And then finally, we're going to be looking at data on the county's rental housing market. And we're going to be looking at a lot of different sources of data. You may be aware that the planning department has already done some analysis of census data and CoStar data. So we're definitely going to be looking at their work. But in addition, the county also conducts an annual rental survey of landlords. And we are going to be analyzing data from that survey. And we are also going to be looking at complaint data on rent increases, which is of, as many of you may be aware, is of great interest to the council members. And then we're going to be looking at any other sources of data and information. So, you know, obviously the eviction data is an important piece of this puzzle. But as we look at this data, and we've been kind of looking at the rental survey, we have spoken with the planning department staff about the sources of the data that they looked at. None of these data sources is perfect. Many of them are, particularly the rental survey data is lagged. So the latest data that we have is from a year ago. So, they are all, different pieces that inform the larger picture, but none of them give us a complete picture of what is going on. And so that is the reason why I wanted to share my information with folks today, because it is really helpful for us to hear people's stories, not just to understand more recent information about what folks are experiencing as renters, but also because as we look at the data, it's always just helpful to know what's really happening on the ground, because when you look at numbers, that doesn't always tell you everything. So I've pretty much talked about everything that I was going to cover. I did see that there was a question in the chat about when the council is scheduled to vote on these bills. I do know that there is a committee discussion scheduled for June 15th at this point, but I don't believe that a final vote has been scheduled. I could be wrong about that, but I think that right now where we're at is there's a committee discussion scheduled for June 15th. So with that said, I'm going to share my information in the chat, and I'm also happy to answer any other questions.
Natalia, that's correct. The June 15th is the only date we have. The Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee used to be the Planning, Housing, and Community and Economic Development Committee. Now it's the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee, which is chaired by Andrew Friedson. and includes Natalie Fanny Gonzalez and Will Jawando are the 3 council members who are the members of that committee. Will have their own probably work session on the legislation that's being proposed, and may have hearings as well. I think for all of us, we have to consider how long we can wait and what needs to be done between now and then. I urge everyone who is listening to this and beyond to stay active now. The council has said that they are going to be focused on the budget, as they should be, and are working toward passing a budget around May 15th. But they are doing other things. And one of those things ought to be considering these very, very important pieces of legislation, and we should have input. And you are all urged to contact your council members and tell them what you think, what your experiences are. And also, we are working with the county to collect information on excessive rent increases. And if you've got an excessive rent increase over 5%, say, over 6%, then please let us know and contact the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs at ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.gov. Malek or Pat, if you could put that in the chat, that would be good. ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.gov. And copy us at info@rentersalliance.org. We'd like to know, because we like to keep track of them too. The county's voluntary rent increase guidelines, voluntary, used to be mandatory. Now they've been voluntary for several decades now, as 5.8% this year. That's very high. On average, it's about 2 or 3%. This year is an anomaly because of the inflation issue that has been occurring around the country. But still 5.8%. We're seeing rent increases at 8, 9, 10, 12, 20%, 29%, and higher. So if you're in the 5.8 or less, it's high, but at least we could say there's some justification for those kinds of rents this year, increases this year. But generally speaking, 2 or 3% is about where they've been on average for many, many years. Last year was 0.4%. The year before that was 2.6%. So just keep that in mind about what the CPI for the county for rental housing is calculating. All right, what kind of questions might we have for anybody on our panel? Pat, Malek, anybody?
Honestly, I think they've all addressed them.
Okay.
I'm not seeing
There is a link by Andrea in the Q&A that may be of value to you, Natalia. And you can use it as you choose.
I can. Do you want me to?
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Matt, I'd love to ask a question of Natalia, if that's okay. Great.
Please.
So one of the things I heard in the hearings from folks who were concerned about rent legislation was the idea that rent legislation prevents the development of affordable housing or prevents people being able to do housing maintenance. But they didn't really talk about the difference between what rent legislation is supposed to do as opposed to what other policies are supposed to do that are specifically targeted around supply or around code enforcement. And so the comparison felt like, like they were having a conversation about why rent stabilization was a terrible thing in Tacoma Park, but they weren't talking about any other aspects of what shapes the development environment, including the availability of literal space to do larger multifamily development, housing developments in Tacoma Park. So I was curious for the OLO report, when you all talk about those kinds of comparisons, are you also going to be talking about the wider policy environment that surrounds a piece of rent legislation so that any comparisons are really more contextual?
That's a really good question. So yes and no. So we do, my colleagues and I are very kind of aware that sort of this is part of a larger picture. However, we can't, I would love to write a book about affordable housing, but we don't have time to do that. So what I can tell you is that we will be focusing on kind of the empirical research. So you may be aware that a lot of the research that has been talked about in the past is based on kind of economic theory. And so we're really focusing on kind of what we are actually seeing in the real world in terms of impacts. And then also putting that into context of, you know, there are other pieces of the picture in terms of affordable housing, but we will not be going into depth on those other pieces.
It would be great to follow up on that, Natalia. I had the misfortune, even though he's a dear friend of mine, in graduate school of having a PhD economist as a roommate. You know, he was a very, he and I both served in the Peace Corps. He was a very progressive kind of guy. And he understood the canons of economic theory and how sometimes they are very narrow in terms of how they evaluate economic outcomes. You know, when he worked for agriculture industry, and you know, the way in which they evaluate it was their costs, the market context, and profits. And very rarely did, as an economist, the majority of economists tend to look at the success of that industry within that context. And they don't look laterally at the other relationships of that profit engine to everything else. So you might have a pharmaceutical pill created that cures the common cold, and they leave out and it's making tons of money, but it's also poisoning the water. So they tend not to think about the lateral relationship of that economic activity to other things. And yet there's now a movement among economists to start thinking laterally about not just, you know, oftentimes they're hired by an industry to say, how can we make much more money? But as a theory, as a you know, academic theory process, to start thinking about it more holistically and contextually, to find out, you know, we know what the rental housing industry says about how rent stabilization is going to limit profits. But what we don't see in those analyses is how the trade-off to the other costs that it's going to limit in terms of social impact, financial impact on people, what the potential is for prosperity when we have stable, affordable housing for the long run, you know, and other types of sort of broader holistic view of the economics. And so, you know, we know what the landlords, we've been at this for a while, so we know what the landlords and the industry say and what they object to. And I'm wondering specifically, will your study go into the specific objections that have been raised by many of the people who oppose rent stabilization, to analyze that and whether or not it's true, kind of like a fact checker? Will, you know, is the Tacoma Park example that is often used a reality? Is it fair? The landlords argue that, well, they're not building anything in Tacoma Park. Yet people in Tacoma Park say, well, where are you going to build it? You're going to build it on top of Jamie Raskin's house? So, you know, the land that was available in the 60s isn't available now, and the cost of the land is different. And there are other issues besides Tacoma Park's rent stabilization program. So it would be good, as a free suggestion, to look at some of the objections, common objections that have been raised, the St. Paul example, the Oregon example, and to have a objective good faith analysis by someone like you in your office.
Thanks. That's also a good question. So the reason I want to kind of be a little cautious about answering this is because we are not in a position where we can kind of do our own independent analysis of what's happened in Tacoma Park. So, you know, we do want to be aware and allow our report to be responsive to the questions that people have. And because of that, we are certainly, you know, paying attention to kind of what the discourse is. But in terms of kind of we have to rely on sort of the research that's been done and summarizing that research. And unfortunately, we can't kind of really do an in-depth analysis of like the housing market in Tacoma Park and development there and why, you know, what has happened has happened. So that's going to be a limitation of our report.
But would you be able to look at the issue of I mean, I'm assuming you've talked to us and hopefully talk to us again, but I'm assuming you'll also talk to the landlord industry, to the AOBA and the multifamily housing groups and the real estate groups, and they will provide examples. And those examples, you know, may not be true. And I'm wondering how your office will analyze that from an academic standpoint, from a fact-based database standpoint, whether it be Tacoma Park as their example or someplace else, or the generalized statement that if you have a rent stabilization program, no one will invest, the quality of housing will decline, people will move out, and so on. That is a common narrative, and it certainly deserves academic study.
Certainly, and I guess I should have mentioned that, you know, there is research in general about these topics, and so that will definitely be a part of the report. What will probably not be a part of the report is kind of a specific look at Tacoma Park. And in other words, we will be looking at kind of the history of what's happened in terms of rent regulations in Tacoma Park and how their rent regulations are structured. But we probably won't be doing an in-depth analysis of how it's impacted development in Tacoma Park. But we will be looking at the research on how rent regulations impact development in general. And that would probably be how we would respond to any question that raised that issue.
What else, folks? Anything else out there? Someone asked what the average rent increases are in the DMV. Anybody know? Hi. That's about the best I can do. This year is an anomaly. Well, I mean, it's not really an anomaly. It's part of a chain of ever increasing rents. But we have not seen any kind of regional data report of late. But a lot of reports in the New York Times, Washington Post, and other papers of record have been showing increasing rents all over our region. And as I say, our experience is we're seeing some outrageously increased rents. I will say also, other piece of data point is that, which we think represents the tip of the iceberg. Back in 2022, January of 2022, the writs of restitution, that is, after someone goes to court and there's a judgment against them for failure to pay rent, the landlord must file what's known as a writ of restitution, a paper that says, I want the apartment back. I want to repossess the apartment. Then that is signed off by the judge and goes to the sheriff's office, who then puts a notice on the door, red and white, that says you're going to be evicted in a week or two, or if you're lucky, a little longer, but a week could be a week or two. Your eviction is imminent. So those are called writs of restitution. We've been receiving those reports for over a year now. Back in January of 2022, the writs that were filed were about 53. Now, part of that is because of COVID, and good part of it because of COVID, and because of the eviction protections that were in place and the courts being closed for a period. But last January, we saw over 500 writs of restitution filed. And this month, there were over 800 writs of restitution filed. So the trajectory is quite the hockey stick of the courts operating at full bore, with 500 cases in the morning and 500 cases in the afternoon, majority of which are failure to pay rent cases because people cannot, or some people are still behind in their rent, and some people are getting further behind because they're seeing their rent increases, but their rent out of reach. So keep that in mind, that we are in fact seeing a forced migration of working folks and middle-class folks and seniors and people on fixed incomes and our most vulnerable populations forced out of their homes in our region. And that data does not tell us how many people move before they go to court, what we call self-evicting, people who have given up, have figured out that they're going to be evicted and leave before they go to court. And that information is not captured. People who have done the math and figured out that they may be able to afford it this year, but in 2 or 3 years, they're not going to be able to afford it. And people who are facing imminent eviction or have received a notice to vacate or a threatening notice from their landlord and have just decided to move on their own before facing a long battle. And we don't know where they're going. We don't know what's happening to them. We don't know if they're sleeping on people's couches. We don't know if they've moved back home with family. We don't know if they've gone to a homeless shelter. And that data is something that we've urged the Department of Housing and Community Affairs to capture. And now that we have Natalia, we urge her to capture it too, if she can. Anything else out there from our folks? I will say that because it's Passover and one of our rabbi advisors told me that things start to happen when you have at least 2 stars in the sky. We're not quite there yet. So if we're almost done, we will wind up. Anything else, staff?
I think there is a question, is Montgomery County considering the effect of short-term rentals on price gouging in commercial real estate properties?
Depends on what you mean by short-term rentals. If you're talking about Airbnb or hotels or...
I would imagine the 3 and 6 month short-term rentals. But
I don't know. I think, we passed the legislation with the county council that requires every renewal to include a 2-year lease offering. That doesn't mean that you could also get a month-to-month or a 6-month or 1 year or 18 months if you so choose. But we have seen dramatic increases in month-to-month rents. So I'm not really sure how to answer that, but it would be the Renters Alliance position that whether you're month-to-month or for 6 months or for a year or 2 years or 10 years, that your rent be at increase be reasonable and predictable. And bear in mind also that no rent can go up more than once in a 12-month period by law.
Got it. Pat, do you see anything? Okay.
I think I saw it.
I think everything was answered fairly clearly.
Brandy?
Was the question about the timing of the report answered? Maybe I missed that.
So, no, I don't think I've answered that one. So we are working hard to try to get this report out before the work session that's happening on June 15th. So that's our goal, is to have that ready for that work session. I also saw that there was a question about whether OLO has data on eviction and rent burden data by demographic groups. And to my knowledge, eviction data doesn't, they don't report the demographics of individuals or families facing eviction. We do look at the rent burden data that's available from the Census Bureau. And so we're very aware that, when you look at people who are cost burdened, that is gives you a good sense of who's at risk of eviction. And so that would definitely be something that we're looking at. And then, and I'm sorry, I didn't realize the question about the average rent increase percentage occurring right now. I don't have an answer, and unfortunately I can't share findings today, but I did want to mention that, as I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of the data that we're looking at is lagged. And so at this stage, I do not anticipate that we will have information on the current rent increases that are happening today, for example. That's just one of the limitations of the data that we have.
But if we find that, and I believe the Department of Housing and Community Affairs is looking at that now, we will share it as soon as we have it. And others are looking at it now. We will share it as soon as we have it. And others are looking at it. I forgot the apartment community analysis groups, but we do collect that data from time to time. And if we have it, you're in our newsletter. And if you're on this call, you will be in our newsletter. We'll share that information. I also saw something from Valerie, HOC's waiting list. It's terrible information, but they have about 8,000 vouchers and about 36,000 on a waiting list. That doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. If you think you qualify, get on that waiting list. As it is our understanding at this time that these are not on first come, first serve. These are about priorities based on your situation. So if you think you're going to qualify for an HOC voucher, please get yourself in the system. And I think that just about covers it for now. Brandy.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. I wanted to note that question about impact on demographic groups actually has a lot to do with what we're struggling with in Montgomery County around good data collection that helps us do analysis when it comes to racial equity. This is something that the county's Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice is, working to get better at implementing throughout county agencies, because when we don't collect data that has that information, then we can't go back and analyze the data according to that information. I also just wanted to highlight and again, thank Natalia and a lot of her colleagues in the Office of Legislative Oversight. It is really great that we have this kind of body that is able to do this kind of research and really dig in on the background behind the things we do in legislation. And I do want to note that this is also the same office that produces the racial equity and social justice analyses that go along with legislation at the county council. And so again, these are the folks who are really working to try and understand what the impacts are of the legislation that people seek to pass in our county, so that we as the public have good information about that, and we can really advocate with our legislators to take action that is very much in the public interest and certainly in the interest of equity and justice.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, Brandy. And thanks to everyone who participated tonight. This town hall was recorded. It will be on YouTube if you want to go back and listen to another point or two. Again, happy Passover. We're going to close early so that I have time to go put lamb's blood on my door. So everybody, happy Passover. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Brandy Brooks, Malek, and Pat. Good night to everyone. Thanks.
Good night. Thanks for having me. Bye.